Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this Dorothy Dunnett lecture. Delighted that you can join us, and I'm sure you will enjoy this. So many of you will have visited Bruges and the Jerusalemkerk, and have also come to know and love the charismatic Anselm Adorne through the wonderful books of Dorothy Dunnett and the Niccolo series. So I'm Jill Harrison. I'm a trustee of the Dorothy Dunnett Society, and I've been asked to chair this session, which is a great pleasure, because I have worked with Jelle before, our speaker, and he very modestly calls himself the operations and marketing manager at the Adornesdomein. But he's so much more than that. We know that and what he does, and his knowledge of the Adornes family and the Jerusalemkerk is really impressive. And he's been a great friend to the Dorothy Dunnett Society. He's provided information and wonderful images for Whispering Gallery. And personally, he's been an invaluable supporter of my book project, always willing to share his expertise, and we're very, very grateful for that. So the plan this afternoon is that Jelle will talk to us for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we'll take a few questions. But you can, if we don't cover these, you can put them in the chat box. You can talk to us at the end of the session. But if we don't have time to respond, then do remember that these will go into the Q&A session, which will be on March the 7th. Now, what will happen is that this recording will go up on YouTube, and a link will be given very soon on the Dorothy Dunnett Society website. And there's also all the information and the links for the March the 7th QA. So you can look through at the recording again, and please send us questions. Our chairman, who's with us today, Nikki, and who's very kindly doing all the tech things for us, has put up my address in the chat box. So you get in touch directly with me with any questions, and then I'll be able to sort them out when we have the session on the 7th of March. And I think that's the only technical stuff that I need to do. Is there anything else, Nikki, that I've forgotten there?
No.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great. I'm very relieved that you're there to keep us all right. So finally, I'm delighted to introduce the speaker, Jelle Deltcombe, whose talk is entitled Anselm Adorne, Destined for Greatness. And this will cover the Adornes family, the Golden Age of Bruges, and Adorne's wonderful legacy in the Jerusalemkerk. So I'll hand over to Jelle, and we'll take a few questions at the end. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jill. Thank you for the Dorothy Dunnett Society for letting me speak here today. My name is Jelle. I've worked at the Adornes estate for the past 6 years now. My native tongue is Dutch, so if I make any mistakes, I apologize right now. But before working here, I worked at the Groothuizen Museum in Bruges as well. So when I first arrived at the Adornes estate, Anselm was certainly no stranger to me. Over the years, however, I've gotten to known Anselm through a variety of sources preserved in the Adornes archives and the city archives. These documents offer us glimpses into his life, what he purchased, who he corresponded with, the offices he held, the taxes he paid. They allow us to reconstruct his activities with remarkable precision. And yet, despite this wealth of information, Anselm the person often remains elusive. The archives tell us what he did, but rarely who he was. Was he generous, pragmatic, ambitious, severe in business, or unexpectedly compassionate? In many ways, it remains a form of educated guesswork for historians, for guides, and even for the present-day owners of the Adornes estates. Not long after I began working here, I met visitors from all over the world who had come to Bruges because of Lady Dunnett. They spoke of Anselm Adornes not as a distant historical figure, but as someone vividly alive. Through Dunnett's writing, he had acquired voice, temperament, wit, and presence. What struck me most about these visitors was not only their passion, but also their attentiveness and deep respect for this site. Through Dorothy Dunnett, I realized Anselm Adornes had become more than a name in the records. He had become a human being. And for that, everyone working at the Adornes estate is forever grateful. However, I am no Dorothy Dunnett expert at all, and for this event I will have to keep to the sources in our archives to tell you all about the Anselm Adornes I know. In the next hour or so, I will try to paint a picture of the multifaceted man that was Anselm Adornes. It is difficult to summarize his entire fascinating life in an hour, but this is my attempt. To understand the man Dorothy Dunnett so brilliantly reimagined, we must first step back to the origins of the family. The story of Anselm does not begin in Bruges, nor in Flanders, but in Genoa. And not much is known about the very first Adornes or Adorno that arrived in Bruges, but he must have been a man of many remarkable qualities. What we do know is that he came from Genoa in Italy. The Adorno were a known and respected family in Genoa as bankers and merchants, and they had been in contact with Flanders for a number of decades. Sometime around 1320, one of these Adorno family members traveled north and settled in Bruges, perhaps attracted by the many opportunities offered by one of Europe's leading commercial and financial centers. In the beginning of the 14th century, the county of Flanders was one of the most populous regions in Western Europe. In spite of disasters as several wars and the Black Death, Bruges was able to flourish economically in the 14th and 15th century, eventually becoming the richest city in Flanders. The city's direct link with the North Sea was crucial for this development. The tedious and dangerous overland journey to the annual fairs in the Champagne region was no longer necessary, as maritime transport was safer. Merchants from all over Europe were granted privileges and concessions by the city administration. These foreigners needed a place to eat, drink, and sleep. They needed financial services to exchange foreign currencies and conduct business transactions in safety. The people of Bruges welcomed these merchants and travelers with open arms. It is in such an environment that the cunning and clever members of the Adornes family could thrive. As you can see here, there are 5 generations between this first Adornes from 1320 and Anselm. His ancestors became prominent figures in the city of Bruges as innkeepers, politicians, bankers, and they were members of the highest social class. They served as councillors, aldermen, city treasurers, and mayors of the city. Anselm's father, Peter II, and uncle Jacob profiled themselves as patricians, loyal to the Dukes of Burgundy. By the start of the 15th century, the Adornes family belonged to the highest circles of Bruges society. Their trading and financial activities had helped them to amass a considerable fortune. Their support for the Duke had opened the door to high offices, both in Bruges and at the ducal courts. Anselm Adornes was surely destined for greatness. And it is here that our story truly begins. On the 8th of December in 1424, Elisabeth Braderick, wife of Peter II Adornes, gave birth to a healthy son, Anselm Adornes. These drawings, depicting Anselm and his wife Margaretha van der Bank, are one of the 3 illustrations we have of Anselm and how he might have looked like. They are design drawings for statues that were intended to be placed above the entrance doors to the upper chapel of the Jerusalem chapel, but they were never made. Young Anselm received the best possible education. His native tongue was Middle Dutch, but his father also taught him Italian from an early age. He studied Latin at St. Donatians in Bruges, and in 1438, when he was just 14 years old, he went to the university in Leuven. As a young man, he was witness to the most important events during the Golden Age of Bruges, the jousting tournaments, the Holy Blood procession, and the concerts given by the musicians on the balcony of the Belfry Tower. At the age of 6, he witnessed the entry of Isabella of Portugal into Bruges. The The Duchess was carried through the city on a litter, decorated with gold, ivory, and brocades, mounted between two white horses with bridles made from silver and Cordoba leather. It made an impression on the young Anselm. Little by little, Anselm was introduced to the codes and rituals that were a part of the patrician life he was expected to lead. His carefree childhood years came to an end in 1436, when Bruges rebelled against Duke Philip the Good. The Adornes family, well-known supporters of the Dukes of Burgundy, fled the city. After nearly 2 years, the rebels were finally stopped, and the Duke's repression was relentless. When Anselm returned to Bruges, he saw the severed heads of the rebel leaders fixed on spikes on the cross gate as a warning to others. It was an important lesson for the 12-year-old Anselm. This was the price to be paid by those who were not loyal to those in power. Anselm was nearly 19 years old when he married the 3 years younger Margaretha van der Bank. He had become a man now, and he began his political career. He became councillor, head of 2 quarters in the city treasurer, and finally mayor of Bruges. He was a guardian to the leper's house and a governor of the enclave of Saint Donation. Anselm understood that a good network was as crucial for success as hard work. He was frequently seen at the events where the highest social class of Bruges resided. One of the most prestigious society clubs was this one, the left one, the Witte Beer, a jousting club that held their meetings in the Poortersloge. Their symbol, a white bear, can still be seen on the building. He was known as one of the most aggressive participants in these jousting tournaments, and he fought against legendary knights as Adolphe of Cleve and Jacques de Lalaing. In 1447, he organized his own tournament near the ponds of Male Castle. In what was supposed to be a friendly tournament, he drove his lance so forcefully into Cornelis Mettenaeus' helmet that it burst open, almost killing his opponent. Just like his ancestors, Anselm became a loyal supporter of the Dukes of Burgundy. In 1468, to mark the marriage between Charles the Bold, Philip the Good's successor, and Margaret of York, Anselm was given the honor of organizing the jousting tournament on the market square of Bruges, alongside Anthony of Burgundy, a bastard son of Philip the Good. Anselm had numerous contacts with influential people in the city of Bruges. Jan de Baanst, an advisor to Philip the Good, the very wealthy Jacob van der Beurze, banker and commercial agent, and of course, Lodewijk van Gruthuizen, knight in the Order of the Golden Fleece. Lodewijk would also become a godfather to one of Anselm's children. A chapel with stained glass windows and statues, a library with illustrated manuscripts and paintings by great masters, the businessman Anselm Adornes surrounded himself with gorgeous arts. Like his parents, Anselm was an important patron of the arts. He had contacts with masters such as Hugo van der Hoes and Petrus Christus, artists now considered to be Flemish primitives. And he also owned 2 small panels by Jan van Eyck, the greatest Flemish primitive of all time. They were given to him by his father, and he left the panels to his 2 daughters, Margaretha and Louise, as you can see here, as he has written down in his will. Although, as you might have read last week or the week before, I'm not sure, new research done with AI would suggest that these paintings are not from the hand of Jan van Eyck. It's interesting research that we are following up closely. But the broad interest in culture is typical of the entire Adornes family, even today. Unlike some of his ancestors, Anselm was less interested in banking, and he distinguished himself in international commerce. He imported alum, a mineral that was used to dye wool. Alum was added to open the fibers of the wool so that the coloring would be more firmly fixed. A few days after this process was done, the coloring plants would be added: madder for red, woad for blue, and welt for yellow. Anselm himself had a residence on the Verversdijk, which can be translated as Paintersdijk. On this detail of the map by Marcus Gerards, you can see the first arrow pointing to the Jerusalem chapel, but his residence was where the second arrow is pointing to. Here he owned a large complex of cellars, warehouses, galleries, stables, an inn, and 3 dyeing workshops. And it is here that, according to me at least, the most fascinating aspect of Anselm's life began: his travels. We'll zoom in on the map of Marcus Gerards. This again shows his residence at the Verversdijk, and you can see that Marcus Gerards even put the effort in of putting the street names on his map. The name near Anselm's residence here is the Zwerversdijk, so the Middle Dutch name for Paintersdijk. But at the other side, we can see, we can read Schottendijk, a reference to Scotland. This street was filled with wool dye industry. The business owners knew where Anselm lived to buy his alum. But of course, they also needed another key ingredient: wool. As was always the case in Flanders, if we got too close to France and imported their wool, England would make a fuss about it. If we got too close to England and imported their wool, then France would get upset. So Bruges chose a safe third option to import wool from: Scotland. This Schottendijk was filled with Scottish merchants, mainly bringing wool to Flanders. And it is here that his fascinating aspect of Anselm begins, his diplomatic mission to Scotland. The year is 1467, and a disaster has called for the summoning of the 4 members. This was a meeting between the representatives of Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, and the Frank of Bruges. The disaster that had occurred was the trade embargo imposed by the King of Scotland, King James III. As entire Flanders relied on the wool import from Scotland, this commercial disaster had to be resolved. The Duke of Burgundy knew that Anselm Adornes had good contact with the Scots, and he sent him on a diplomatic mission to King James III. There, Anselm held an impassioned plea on behalf of the interests of Bruges and called his city the University of Trade. And this plea made a strong impression on the young Scottish king. And during the long negotiations that followed, a friendship and mutual respect grew on both sides. The mission was crowned with success. The king withdrew the embargo, and the Scottish merchants returned to Bruges. Not only did this give a huge boost to the prestige of Anselm, he was rewarded with a lifelong dream. He officially became a nobleman. The Scottish king made him a knight in the Order of the Unicorn. He appointed him as royal advisor and granted him the manor of courtkeeping. It is via this painting by Hugo van der Hoes that I first got into contact with Professor Jill Harrison, who knows a lot more about this painting than I do. But it's very interesting. Her research led to Anselm as well. Was it Anselm Adornes that brought the King of Scotland in contact with Hugo van der Hoes? And is Anselm himself depicted on this painting on the far right as St. George? After the journey, Anselm's reputation was now at its zenith, and the Duke of Burgundy would rely on Anselm more in the future. And although this lecture is about Anselm Adornes, I would like to take a minute to talk about his wife, Margaretha van der Bank. Like so many women of her time, she remains largely invisible in historical records. Yet the fragments we do possess suggest that she played a quietly significant role. If ever the phrase, behind every great man stands a great woman, were justified, it would surely apply to Margaretha. She bore Anselm 16 children. I'll let that sink in for a minute. 16 children, a remarkable reality in itself, but her importance extended far beyond the domestic sphere. When the Boyd family fell from favor and the king's sister was forced into exile, it was Margaretha who welcomed her to the Adornes estate. She received the royal guest and her household with generosity, offering them refuge. This act of hospitality carries both political and symbolic weight. It strengthened the bonds between Anselm and the Scottish court, deepened King James's gratitude, and enhanced Anselm's prestige in Bruges as the host of a foreign princess. Anselm's most remarkable feat, however, is his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When he made his plans, he was fully aware of the risks involved. More than 5,000 kilometers by horse and boat, and just 17 years after the fall of Constantinople, he knew that this journey would be very dangerous. He wrote his will, and it's here that we find the reference to the two paintings by Jan van Eyck. He also gave detailed instructions for his eventual burial in the Jerusalem chapel. Fortunately, we have a lot of information about this pilgrimage. Jan Adornes, Anselm's son, traveled with him and made an itinerary when they arrived back home. This travel account offers us a rare and vivid glimpse into what these men experienced on their extraordinary expedition to the east. We sense their fear when violent storms at sea nearly capsize their ship, or when a local emir in Beirut briefly takes them captive. We share their amazement as they encounter unfamiliar wonders, the first sight of a camel, the Nile, which they describe as the most beautiful river imaginable, and Damascus, hailed as the most magnificent city they had ever seen. Through their words, the journey becomes more than a route on a map. It becomes a story of danger, discovery, and profound wonder. Jan wrote 3 versions of this journal, one for the family archives, one intended for the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, and one for King James III of Scotland. Of these 3, only the copy destined for the Scottish king has survived the passage of time, and today it is preserved in the library of Lille in northern France. 2 years ago, we created a faithful facsimile of this remarkable manuscript. The text was reproduced, and the volume was bound using techniques that closely follow 15th century methods. I could spend another 2 hours just talking about Anselm's pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. This is the route he took, both when he went to Jerusalem and when he returned. And it was February 1470 before Anselm's pilgrimage finally set off for Palestine. There were 7 of them in the party, and after receiving the Holy Communion, in the smaller Jerusalem chapel his father built, they mounted their horses and headed south. The journey took them through France, a land still recovering from the 100 Years' War, and after a month they arrived in Milan. Their reception was almost royal. They went hunting with the Duke, they had guided tours of the city and banquets with the local high class. From Milan, they rode to Pavia, where Anselm picked up his son Jan, who had been studying there for the last 5 years. They arrived in Rome on the Wednesday before Easter, and Anselm was granted several private audiences with the Pope, who gave his papal blessing for his pilgrimage. Anselm and his group went on to Genoa, which was not the traditional pilgrim's route. The traditional route was a journey from Venice to Jaffa, now part of Tel Aviv. His Genoese contacts had told him that these Phoenician galleys were packed with pilgrims in the most unhygienic conditions, which made them a deadly breeding ground for sickness of all kinds. 3 of the other pilgrims that traveled with Anselm ignored this advice and went to Venice anyway. It was a fatal decision. More than half of the passengers on their galley contracted diseases on board, from which they later died before completing their journey. From Genoa, they set sail for Tunis on a Genoese carrack, the same kind of vessel that would be used by Columbus to discover America just 20 years later. Equipped with bombards, it offered the pilgrims safety and comfort. And once in Tunis, the Sultan received the company with the utmost respect. They traveled further east, and in Alexandria, in Egypt, they saw what Jan Adornes describes as strange beasts of burden with humps, the camel. Once in Cairo, they were allowed to stay in the Sultan's palace for 8 days. However, the Sultan later charged them with a small fortune for his generous welcome, and he tried to swindle the pilgrims out of every last penny. Anselm and his son explored the city, and they were even granted access to the pyramids. Jan writes, in the desert, there are a number of ancient monuments in the form of a pyramid. Some say that these were granaries, where grain was stored by the pharaoh during the 7 years of plenty, so that it was possible to survive the 7 lean years that followed. But we think they are tombs, because the only entrance is a small doorway, behind which there is a dark and narrow passage that leads to a single chamber, but not a large hall. Very clever. In August, the moment came for them to start the most treacherous leg of their journey, from Cairo to the Holy Land. They stopped at sites like the place where Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had lived during their stay, and the Red Sea where Moses had parted the waves. The exhausting trek was harsh in the extreme. Jan paints a vivid picture of the trials and tribulations of this hellish voyage under the burning sun. At last, on the 24th of August, they saw the sanctuary of the St. Catherine's monastery. The pilgrims were allowed to rest at the monastery, and they were granted permission to touch the corpse of St. Catherine. And here Jan writes, the monks deposited the skull and bones of St. Catherine here after finding her body in the mountains. All the monks were there, and they each held a candle in their hands. They knelt in front of the remains, and one by one they kissed the bones. After this, it was our turn to view the relics and kiss them twice. My father, Anselm Adornes, was given permission to bring his rings and jewels into contact with the bones. The brothers also laid a piece of silk on the bones, tore it in strips, and gave each of us a fragment. In the refectory of that monastery, they were even allowed to write their names on the wall, as you can see here. You can see Jo Adornes, Jan Adornes, and Anselm Adornes with the year 1470. 2 years ago, in preparation of our exhibition, I decided to pick up my phone and ring the monastery. I was greeted by a very friendly father, and when I explained that the names of Anselm and Jan Adornes were somewhere to be found in the refectory, he sent me this picture 15 minutes later. I will come back to this picture later on, because there's an interesting tidbit to be told in relation to Dorothy Dunnett. It was now time to push on to their final destination, Jerusalem. Without any incidents, they reached the Holy City on the 11th of September in 1470. They visited all the holy places they had come so far to see, the ruins of the temple, and of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here, they were told that 3 weeks earlier, a group of 40 or so pilgrims had succumbed to disease on the road to Jerusalem. Among the dead, the 3 former companions, who had left them in Rome to take the galley in Venice. Father and son Adornes were terrified, because the only way back was the same way these pilgrims had arrived, by boat from Jaffa. When they left Jerusalem 2 weeks later, they were told they were not allowed to ship out for a number of days. The coast of Jaffa was being terrorized by Christian pirates. And they decided to visit Nazareth, Damascus, and Beirut. There they found a Venetian captain who was prepared to take them via Cyprus and Rhodes to the south of Italy. It was here, just as they were boarding the ship, that they were arrested by soldiers of the local emir, who had no doubt been tipped off that these wealthy foreign visitors were worth ransoming. Only after paying a huge bail, the local emir let his prisoners go. Although the journey started very positively with a plea of tolerance for other cultures, Anselm and Jan had had enough by this point. And Jan writes, full of joy and happiness, like a hare that has escaped from wild dogs, we boarded our ship, away from the Moors who had never welcomed us as people, but treated us as beasts or animals that have no reason for existence. To say they were relieved to be back on Christian ground would be an understatement. They visited Naples, where they had a banquet with King Ferdinand and had a new audience with Pope Paul II in Rome. By February 1471, they were in Venice, where the city was in the middle of its carnival season. They stayed here for 2 weeks. By March, the news of their arrival went ahead of them, so that the family and friends were waiting to greet them at the city gate when they finally arrived back in Bruges on April the 4th, 1471. The next 6 months, Jan Adorne stayed in Bruges to write up his account of their amazing adventures along the way. The prestige of Anselm boosted to a new height. The name Adornes and Jerusalem were now mentioned in the same breath. Inspired by his journey, Anselm demolished his father's Jerusalem chapel and replaced it with a new house of prayer, a copy of the Holy Sepulchre Church, and a fitting shrine for the holy relics they brought with them. Unfortunately, the prestige would quickly fade away. Charles the Bold dies unexpectedly on the battlefield at Nancy in France in January of 1477. His teenage daughter Mary succeeds him, and a revolt breaks out in several cities. People are tired of the warmongering dukes and their constant thirst for money. Anselm is called upon to mediate, along with his friend Lodewijk van Gruthuizen. Initially, they restore the peace in Bruges, but in March, new riots break out. Anselm ends up in prison. His charges are corruption and wrongful appropriation of money. In May of 1477, Anselm is tortured until he confesses to stealing from the city treasure chests. The punishment is humiliating. He has to walk barefoot and dressed in a black robe, and he has to ask forgiveness in front of every church in Bruges. And believe me, Bruges has quite a lot of churches. He is barred from public office, and he is heavily fined. After this utter humiliation, he had no business staying in Bruges. He fled to a place where he was still respected, Scotland. He settles in Linlithgow, where he acquires 3 houses in one of the most prestigious streets of the town. He also has a manor in Blackness, where the king often visits. But here he finds himself in a hornet's nest of intrigue and problems with the unpopular King James III. In July of 1482, during a coup against King James III, a number of Anselm's allies die. He knows he's in danger, and for the second time, he writes his will. Here, he writes that he realizes a number of enemies are after him, but that he would sooner die than betray his king. On the 23rd of January 1483, Anselm goes on another pilgrimage to a monastery near Noordberg. Here, during dinner, the monastery is surrounded by 18 riders on horseback and 200 foot soldiers, enemies of the king. Anselm knows they're there for him. He willingly goes outside and he begs the soldiers to save the lives of the sisters inhabiting the monastery. A gory murder report explains what happens. A sword strikes him on the soldier, tearing open his body below his heart. A second blow splits his leg, and the third finally cleaves his head. He is robbed of his clothes, his jewels, and even his chains of office. The chain of the Order of the Unicorn, which he so proudly wore, was never found again. On the windows in the Jerusalem chapel, Anselm is presented in full knight's armor, proudly wearing his necklace of the Order of the Unicorn. Not long after, Anselm was buried in St. Michael's Parish Church in Linlithgow, next to James III's Summers Palace. In 1988, a replica of this chain of the Order of the Unicorn was constructed by the Scottish Heraldry Society and given to Count Henry de Lambertirum and his son Maximilien, descendants of Anselm. Sorry. When the sad news of Anselm's death reaches Bruges, it is not only the death bell of the Jerusalem chapel that tolls, but out of every church in Bruges tolls the death bell. On March the 3rd, 1483, a funeral service was held in the Jerusalem chapel. Later that year, his heart was transferred to Bruges in this lead coffin and laid to rest in the mausoleum in the Jerusalem chapel, where his wife Margaretha already rests. This lead box was found 2 years ago while restoring the tomb. That was a brief summarization of Anselm Adornes, the way I have gotten to know him. There's still quite a lot I haven't covered, but I simply don't have the time. But I want to talk to you about Anselm's legacy today. Because today, 600 years later, his legacy lives on in the Adornes estate in Bruges. Here you can see Count Maximilien de Lambertirum, the 17th generation since Anselm Adornes. His wife, Countess Veronique de Lambertirum, is now president of the non-profit organization, and they have 3 sons, so the legacy still continues. The entire mission of the Adornes estate can be summarized as follows: sharing to bring alive, bringing alive to preserve. The family wants to share this unique heritage with as many people as they can to keep it alive. By opening up the domain to the public, we use the money we receive from entry tickets to preserve the entire estate, which means continuous work in the archives, restoration works, and everything that is necessary to keep this heritage safe and alive. Tourists from all over the world can visit the Adornes estate every day, except on Sundays and holidays. This is a brief glimpse of what you can see here. When you enter at the reception in the shop where you can buy a ticket, we send you all the way at the back to start in our movie room. There's a movie of about 12 minutes long, but it's a good introduction to what are you going to see. Number 2 is the museum, temporary museum. And number 3 is a Scottish lounge. We have an honesty bar where visitors can enjoy a nice cup of coffee and some lovely Scottish shortbreads. During the summer months, we also open the garden. And number 4 is, of course, the Jerusalem chapel itself. As you can see, this is our temporary map, because for now we're restoring the almshouses. We're currently working on a whole new museum inside these almshouses, which we will open in September of this year. And I'll show you some pictures of the estate itself. From the outside, the tower of the Jerusalem chapel immediately grabs attention. The tower with its octagonal shape was based on one of the towers of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but this burned down in the 16th century. Inside the Jerusalem chapel, dozens of symbols remind us of the journey that Anselm undertook. Catherine wheels, as you can see here, referring to their stay at the St. Catherine's Monastery, and Jerusalem crosses can be found everywhere. Their stay in the monastery must have led a huge impact on Anselm, because you can see these wheels everywhere inside the chapel. The Jerusalem chapel itself is a replica of the Holy Sepulchre Church, but this is mainly symbolic. 2 important events in the history of Catholicism happened at the Holy Sepulchre Church: the death of Christ and the burial of Christ. And Anselm wanted to symbolically recreate this in his chapel. When you enter the chapel, your eyes are immediately drawn to the altar. The Golgotha altar has a remarkable shape as it was named after the Golgotha mountain where Christ was crucified. There is a lot to see on the altar, and all these symbols that you can see here are called the Arma Christi, or instruments of the Passion. These are objects associated with the last hours of Christ and were popular in the arts of the late Middle Ages. Objects you can see on the altar include the crown of thorns, the sponge that was used to offer gall and vinegar to Jesus, the Holy Lance, the nails, the robe of Christ, and so on. The most remarkable fact, however, is that the crosses on top of the altar are empty. This is, as far as I know, the only church or chapel in the world where Christ isn't depicted on the cross, as the symbolism here refers to the fact that Christ has already passed away, just like the Holy Sepulchre Church. The tomb of Christ is the second symbol, is symbolically represented in the crypt. This was not built by Anselm, but by Jan de la Coste Adornes. He was Anselm's great-grandson in the beginning of the 16th century. If you have ever been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, you'll see a line of hundreds of pilgrims queuing up to go near the tomb of Christ. And just like the Jerusalem chapel, a visitor has to bow his or her head as a sign of respect to go near the tomb. We are also part of a project instituted by Visit Flanders, the tourism platform of Flanders. This project is called Flemish Masters in Situ, and there are around 120 places in Flanders that are part of this project. The idea is that Flemish masters often created their artworks for a specific location, such as a church, castle, or a town hall, and many of these artworks have moved to museums, but some can still be viewed at their original location. There are 5 works of art that are part of these Flemish masters in situ. The 2 paintings, the Golgotha altar, the mausoleum, and the glass-stained windows. And these are the 2 paintings. The painting on the left shows Jan de la Coste, Anselm's great-grandson, as mentioned before, and his wife, Catharina Metteneye, with their children behind them. The city of Jerusalem is equated here with Bruges. So you can see Bruges on the background. It was a fitting memorial scene for the couple, who were also buried here. You can recognize the towers of Bruges, and here, I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing at, but here you can see the tower of the Jerusalem chapel as well. Jan de la Coste Adornes is generally seen as the last great figure of the family. He was born de la Coste, but in 1512, with permission of his Genoese ancestors, he was allowed to carry on the name Adornes. The triptych on the right depicts the Virgin Mary with Christ, Saint Barbara on the right, and Saint Catherine on the left, recognizable by her sword and her wheel, which you can see here. Then the glass-stained windows are the oldest windows in Bruges, dating back to 1560. They depict 7 generations of the Adornes family, starting with Peter I, which you can see here on the left, the grandfather of Anselm, and ending with the brothers, Jacob and Jerome, great-great-grandchildren of Anselm, here on the right. All the patrons of the Jerusalem chapel, and this is Anselm in the middle, I have to say that as well. All the patrons are kneeled towards the altar, with their patron saints behind them, their wives next to them, and their patron saints behind them as well. The mausoleum of Anselm and Margaretha in the center of the chapel is also part of the Flemish Masters in Situ, and they depict both Anselm and Margaretha van der Bank. We have 3 known illustrations of Anselm. He is seen on the drawings I showed you earlier, here on the tomb, and he's depicted on the windows as well. Anselm is shown here as a knight, wearing armor that could have been used during jousting tournaments. Margaretha wears an elegant dress, has a henna on her head, and a dog as a symbol of loyalty at her feet. 4 years ago, the tomb was subject to a major restoration project. The lid of the tomb weighs approximately 1,500 kilograms, and when it had to be transported out of the chapel, it had about 1 centimeter of clearance. Very exciting times, but everything went all right. And for the first time ever, we were able to see inside the family tomb. Here, archaeologists found the remains of Margaretha van der Bank. Anselm himself was murdered and buried in Scotland, as you now know. Well, we did, however, find the lead box containing his heart. Besides this skeleton of Margaretha van der Bank, more than 500 additional bones with no anatomical connection were found in the vault. After research, we found out that they belonged to at least 9 fully grown individuals, probably family members from the 16th and 17th century. Sorry. It was during this entire operation that my favorite moment of the past 6 years working here occurred. Time for a short story that is not so widely known. It was a Tuesday in October 2022, and we had planned to reinstall the tomb the following Monday. The bones that had been found had just been returned to the estate after being examined in Brussels. Suddenly, however, I received a phone call from the expert who had been working on the tomb for a year. He told me that he would be coming by with the mausoleum the next day, Wednesday morning, a little earlier than planned. We had only just received the remains back from Brussels, so we started to panic. Everything still had to be put back in place before the tomb arrived. After a few phone calls to the priest of St. Anne's Church, several historians, and the city archivist, among others, we came to the conclusion that the space inside the crypt was consecrated grounds, and they advised us to simply place the bones there. Because we wanted to carry this out with the utmost care and respect, Veronique de Lambertirum, my colleague, and I spent several hours doing so. This was followed by an emotional moment. Veronique asked us to leave the chapel for a moment so that she could say a prayer. And she and her husband each wrote a letter. We were honored to hear Veronique's letter, an emotional plea in which she expressed her hope that the burial vault would remain closed for another 600 years, and that, if it were to be opened again, humanity would be wiser than it was today. After all, the war in Ukraine had only just been going on for a few months at a time. We put the letter in a bottle and placed it in the tomb. And the next day, the tomb was reinstalled. It's a moment I will cherish forever. We'll leave the chapel and we'll have a look at the other buildings of the Adornes estate. Before that, you can see the passage here that connects the Jerusalem chapel to the private house of the Adornes, similar to Lodewijk van Groothuis's palace, which has a connection to the Church of Our Lady. This has been our most recent restoration, and since December of last year, visitors have a unique sight into the private oratory of the family. There is also a 15th century statue of St. Catherine made from albast from Nottingham, which was a gift from the family to honor Anselm's 600th birthday 2 years ago. This is our Scottish lounge as a remembrance of the special link between Anselm and King James III. Visitors are welcome to grab a cup of coffee, read some books from the library, and assemble one of our puzzles. We try to recreate a very cozy, homely, warm place where visitors can feel at home. This is our temporary exhibition as it is now, exploring the life of Anselm Adornes. These rooms are mainly used to present contemporary art exhibitions. After the opening of the new museum this September, we will again be hosting Flemish artists to present their work to an international audience. One of my favorite quotes from Veronique is that Jan van Eyck was modern art in the 15th century. And in spirit of that, the family wants to give a platform to contemporary Flemish artists. And as I said before, restoration works are omnipresent. They are a never-ending story here at the estates. Here are some pictures from 2022 when we repainted the wood on the tower. The middle picture is just a couple of months old when the private oratory and the passageway to the private house were being restored. And the picture on the right-hand side is when the tomb was restored. Furthermore, we try to organize several events during the year, lectures, concerts, other evening nocturnes where we lit up the chapel with hundreds of candles to recreate a very special atmosphere. Some more pictures here. We installed a flowery Jerusalem cross when the tomb was being restored. And on the right-hand side, there was a light spectacle done by video mapping on the tower last year. In 2024, we celebrated the 600th birthday of Anselm Adornes. We organized lectures about some of his interests: art, religion, trade, diplomacy, and pilgrimage. We also invited the Caledonian Society, as you can see here, an organization based in Ghent that wants to promote Scottish culture and heritage. They performed several traditional Scottish dances on the courtyard. And that year, we also started a medieval lottery for charity, which was such a big success that we've organized it every year since. As I said before, this just gives a very brief glimpse of our mission and vision. The family, the Lambertirum, tries to uphold the values that Anselm has taught us: respect, hard work, hospitality, and above all, curiosity. I'd like to leave you with one last relic we keep in our shop. We have a shop as well, next to our Dorothy Dunnett books that we sell as well. And this is a letter written by Lady Dunnett herself. It was addressed to Elena Chiaravari, whose maiden name is Elena Cataneo Adorno. She is the owner of a palazzo in Genoa and is one of the last Adornos left. In 1996, she published a book about the history of her family, and she sent a copy to Dorothy Dunnett. This is Dorothy's response to that. And as you can see, Lady Dunnett was working on the 7th Nicolo book at the time. She discovered Anselm Adornes whilst staying in Bruges, and she speaks about the memorial plate, which you can see here, that Count Maximilien and his father put up in St. Michael's Parish Church in Lindengo, where Anselm is buried. Interestingly, it is here that she also speaks about Anselm's signature, which may still be seen in the refectory of St. Catherine's Monastery, which, as you now know, is still there. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'd like to thank Jill Harrison, Julia Hart, Suzanne McNeil, and Deborah Conway for organizing this event. And thank you, all the Dorothy Dunnett fans, for keeping Anselm Adornes, one of the most fascinating figures in history, alive. Thank you.
Jelle, thank you so much for that. What a fascinating talk, so clear, so informative. If it was possible, you brought Anselm Adorne to life even more than the Dorothy Dunnett books, and told us so much that we didn't know. Thanks for sharing that very moving moment in 2022, and also the letter. How fascinating to see the letter. So I think we've learned so much. I think we felt so much. I think everybody will want to dash back to the Jerusalemkerk and see you at the Adornesdomein if they haven't already. That was such a super talk. Thank you. You've brought up all sorts of things for us to think about. The connections with Scotland, so important. Margaretha van der Bank, who really deserves a shout out always, because she was such an important force. So that was fascinating. So I think everybody will want to look at the recording again and again. I certainly will. And we'll be putting that up on the website very soon. But I'm sure people have got questions. Would anybody who's got a couple of questions that we'll take now, obviously, if there are other questions, you can send them to me. And then we'll have a proper session and a discussion when Jelle very kindly is coming back on the 7th of March to talk to us. So would anybody like to unmute and ask a question now? I'm sure if Jelle doesn't mind a couple of questions, that would be terrific. Would anybody like to say something?
I put a question in the chat. I was fascinated by the translations from Jan Adorne's account of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Are there any plans to digitize his account or to translate any further parts of it?
Well, so Jan Adornes wrote his account in Latin. It was translated to French in the 80s by Professor Jacques Heers. And it is our plan now, because in 2029 we're celebrating the 600th anniversary of the Jerusalem Chapel. It is our plan now to translate everything to Dutch, first and foremost. We have a lot of residents of Bruges as well asking for a travel account as well. So that's our first main goal, is to have a translation to Dutch. But I think if we have a good structured translation to Dutch, and which we're working on right now with a few professors from Ghent, I think it's definitely possible to have a translation to English as well in the future. There is a travel account from Rombout de Doppere. I'll write his name in the chat as well. Rombout de Doppere, who was a notary in the 16th century in Bruges, who wrote a sort of travel guide, a sort of Lonely Planet travel guide to Jerusalem in the 16th century, and he summarized Anselm's journey. This was written in Dutch and is completely digitized. This is something you can find online on the website of the City Archives of Bruges. It is a summarization. I think it's 50 pages instead of the 250 that Jan wrote. It's a summarization of 50 pages of what they went through, and the rest that Rombout de Doppere wrote is a lot of tips and tricks to go to Jerusalem. It's just like a Lonely Planet guidebook. It's yeah. But we'll hope to translate it to English someday. Let's hope so.
Thank you.
I hope you do. That would be a terrific resource to have. So we'll look forward to that. Any other questions?
It's Isabel here. I have a question about the book, Jan's book. Is that written in his hand, or did he write the book and have a scribe transcribe it into the document?
We do think it's his hand. The only version that is kept now is the one that was intended for James III, so we don't have the other two accounts. We do think it's his hand, and one of the reasons we have to think that is because of Professor Jacques Heers, who translated it in the 80s to French. If you read his translation, you can see that Professor Heers gets more and more irritated by the time he gets on, because Jan Adornes, his Latin was not good. And he constantly complains about Jan's Latin. It's quite funny to read, but you can see that Jacques Heers becomes more and more irritated about the lack of Latin knowledge that Jan Adornes had. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
I think we've got time for one more question. Anybody else that would like to ask Jelle while he's here?
May I ask a question? It's Deborah. You mentioned the three images of Anselm. It is there's another painting by a Flemish painter, and I can't remember what it is, but it's supposed to represent Anselm. But he doesn't have. He's almost bald in that one. He doesn't have the lovely long locks, and I just wonder what the Adornesdomein view on that painting was.
Yeah, it depends. I think it's another painting of the workshop of Van Eyck would suggest, with Jerusalem on the background, would suggest that Peter II is depicted on there. So Anselm's father, maybe that's the painting you're thinking of. But
I think it's Petrus
It's by-
Christus.
Yeah, I think it's the Lamentation of
That's the
Petrus
one, yes.
Christus that's got pilgrims going round in the background. And yes, Deborah's right. He is bald then. And did they think that was
Yeah.
because he was in mourning at the time?
The thing is, I know the painting you're talking about, and I would highly doubt that it's Anselm. If it's someone from the Adornes family, it would be Peter II, because
Interesting.
Petrus Christus was active during 1450 till 1455 in Bruges. And I think Anselm would have been 20, 25 years old at the time. I think he would have been too young to really represent, to be on the painting of Petrus Christus. We do know now that we've discovered this a couple of years ago. We knew that Petrus Christus had already painted Peter II and his wife, Elisabeth Braderick, but the paintings were lost. They were last photographed in the beginning of the 20th century, around 1911. And now, 2-3 years ago, this painting resurfaced in Switzerland. One of the paintings, so Elisabeth Braderick, the mother of Anselm and the wife of Peter II, this painting has been resurfaced and is now at the Adornesdomein again. But I would highly doubt that Peter Christus, during the time that he worked in Bruges, which was only about 5 years, 1450, 1455, that he painted Anselm. I think Anselm had proven too little to be on one of his paintings.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think perhaps we will finish there. So thank you for your unique knowledge, Jelle, and to the de Limburg-Sterum family for everything that you do to keep Anselm's legacy alive. We're all very, very grateful for that. So we will see you again on the 7th of March. Thank you. And if everybody else could send in their questions, please, let's have lots of questions that you can send to me directly. But all the details will be up on the Dorothy Dunnett website. So keep an eye out on that. So if there are no other questions, I think we'll end it there. Thank you all very, very much indeed for coming. And we'll see you again, Jelle, on the 7th of March. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.